It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
Well, hello there. This is Phil Ferguson, and of course, you are listening to the cleverly titled The Phil Ferguson Show. It is now 2021, and we're hoping for a better year, but some signs are saying that might not be the case. I just saw a story out of California where for Christmas, an employee wore a air-powered, fan-powered blow-up costume, I think, of a Christmas tree, and walked around the hospital blowing air particles all over the place. So far, there's no indication that the person in the costume was sick or had any bad intentions, but increasing the velocity of air and the particles in it moving around, there are now 44 new cases of employees who had been exposed to this blow-up costume. So, lesson learned, don't wear a blow-up costume. The other thing that may be a pretty big fucking bummer is that there are now variants of coronavirus, and this can happen because evolution. Random genetic mutations may cause a certain strain of the virus to be no longer infectious. And of course, if that happens, no one gets it. It can cause an alternate strain of the virus that becomes more infectious, and guess what? More people get it. The tiny little bit of reading I've done on this subject, and I am not an expert, shows that one of the nice things is that often the increased ability of a virus to spread sometimes maybe correlates with a slightly lower death rate. I don't know that that's the case in this situation, but fingers crossed, maybe that's a bit of good news. But the problem is you could have more people getting sicker faster, which can be a problem if your hospital system is already full. So please be careful out there. Stay safe. I think I can say publicly I have talked to someone at American Atheists, and their conference for 2021 is going to be online, and they're working on all kinds of cool new stuff. I'm not going to give you any details because I might even be ahead of schedule on this, but hopefully I will have a guest on in the next show or two to tell you all about it. Other things in my life, before I get completely sidetracked on that, the segments that are coming up are about money. I have a short one about what to do if you want to give money to kids, grandkids, nephews, nieces, whatever. But the big meaty topic that a lot of people look forward to once each year, right after the beginning of the year, I am going to go over all of the data for what returns were made or what losses were created for calendar year 2020. But before I get into that, I'm going to do a little diversion, I guess. A little update on solar panels. As regular listeners know, I had a whole bunch of solar panels put on my house, and we finally had an event that I had been waiting for a couple of months to see what happened. We got snow. And of course, when solar panels are covered in snow, they're not getting much sunlight, and therefore their production is way the fuck down. And of course, for me, for the last couple of days, it's been rather cloudy. So I think yesterday I got 1.3 kilowatt hours of energy for the entire day, which is the lowest day ever. And I think in late May or June, there's the potential that I can make 60, 70, maybe even almost 80 kilowatt hours in a day. So yesterday was a new low, but that's not even the problem. That's not what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is the fact that, I guess the good news is that the snow mostly slid right off of the solar panels, and that's pretty cool because that means it can snow and then the snow can slide off and I can get power. However, the snow slid off the solar panels, and at the bottom of the solar panels, there's still several more feet of roof and then gutters. So some of the snow slid off, landed on the roof, landed in the gutters, and stopped there. Now, more snow then slid off from higher solar panels and has basically stacked on top of the snow at the very edge of the roof. So I have almost a foot of snow that has slid down the relatively steep incline of my roof to the end of the roof and is sitting on the edge of the roof and on the gutters. My first fear was that the weight of the snow, which could be melting and freezing and melting and freezing, if we get additional snow on top of it, could be too high for the gutters to hold, and the snow ends up just ripping the gutters off of the house. Obviously, a suboptimal thing to happen. The other fear, of course, in housing, my thought process is water is the enemy. You want to keep water away and out of everything. If you can do that, you've solved in advance a whole lot of potential house problems. In a case like this, when that snow at the edge of the gutter, edge of the roof on the gutter melts, that's cool and all, but when it melts and works its way down through the snowpack and gets into the gutter, which is clogged by snow, it may have a hard time rolling through the gutter and down the gutter pipe, downspout. I don't know what to call it. And that water overnight can freeze, turn back into ice. And of course, ice is bigger than water. And if some of that water is packed up underneath roof shingles, freezing it can start to cause damage to your shingles or your roofing material. So that's bad magic. So I then went on this adventure of trying to do something clever without killing myself. And my wife helped me out quite a bit. We tried a couple of different things. We dug out the great big 20-foot tall ladder, only to realize that our roof, being a 2-story house, and the back patio, where the problem is the biggest, is a couple of feet even below the back patio door. The roof is probably 24 feet up, maybe 22 feet up, but the ladder's 20 feet and at a little bit of an angle. And I started going up the ladder with her holding the ladder, but the ladder was on snow/ice on the patio. And so halfway up, I decided that was incredibly stupid and I could end up getting hurt. So we stopped that. And then we started figuring out how to tape together different tubes, pipes, tools to get something to the roof to like pull down the snow. And I thought that was pretty clever. But the problem is that the tool has to be 20 plus feet long. And even then, when I could reach the edge of the roof by standing close to the roof, I could only get to the edge. I mean, I couldn't really get up and over. And so I would have to stand back maybe 10 or 12 feet and put something up at an angle. And so now you're talking about 30 plus feet, and we didn't have anything that really could hold together well enough to do that. And someone on Facebook, I wish I could remember their name. It's on my wall. Someone gave me the idea that they have sometimes get too much snow on the edge of their roof, and they throw up ice melt that you would use on your driveway on their roof. And so I did that. So fingers crossed that I threw up enough ice melt, because what you want to do is have, of course, the snow melt. Someone suggested getting a hose out and spraying it, but that could make the problem a lot worse because you're adding water that is above freezing from your faucet, and at some point it's going to freeze. Well, where is it going to refreeze when the temperature drops? In the ground, on the ground, halfway to the street, to the neighbor's property, or up in the gutter because you didn't get rid of enough snow. So fingers crossed that the ice melt works and helps melt the snow and relieve the weight of snow on the edge of my roof/gutter before you get another 6 or 12 inches of snow. Last year, I don't think we had particularly large amounts of snow, but probably sometime between now and next year, I'm going to have to figure out how to avoid this or prevent this. So I'm open to ideas if someone solved this problem in their house. I've seen where you can install heating elements either on or under the shingles, in the gutter. Again, all of those do worry me slightly because when you melt the water there, melt the snow there, turns the water runs away. It could freeze. If it's below freezing outside, it could freeze somewhere else. And you just move the problem from one place to another. The best thing I've thought of is either adding to the gutters or replacing the gutters outright some kind of like what I guess they call a leaf guard. And I've seen different meshes and stuff that you can put on, but I have also seen really smooth ones where the water goes down it and only curls around at the end to go back into the gutter where anything solid can slide right over it. So maybe the snow that gets that far will just keep sliding and go off the roof, which could cause a little avalanche if you happen to be under it at the wrong time, but I don't want all that weight sitting on the gutter. So some weird and different gutter thing. Gutter talk. We didn't know we were going to have gutter talk today. So we'll take our little break. We'll talk about how to save/invest, gift, give, whatever, manage money for children, some ideas there. And then we're going to talk about 2020 and what the different segments of the stock market did. So you're going to love it. Hang in there.
And they told me the story all about this guy named Lehi who lived in Jerusalem in 600 BC. Now, apparently, in Jerusalem in 600 BC, everyone was completely bad and evil, every single one of them, man, woman, child, infant, fetus. And God came to Lehi and said to him, "Put your family on a boat and I will lead you out of here." And God did lead them. He led them to America. I said, America? From Jerusalem to America by boat in 600 BC? And they said, yes. Then they told me how Lehi and his descendants reproduced, and over the course of 600 years, there were two great races of them, the Nephites and the Lamanites. And the Nephites were totally, totally good, each and every one of them, and the Lamanites were totally bad and evil, every single one of them, just bad to the bone. Then, after Jesus died on the cross for our sins, on his way up to heaven, he stopped by America and visited the Nephites. And he told them that if they all remained totally, totally good, each and every one of them, they would win the war against the evil Lamanites. But apparently somebody blew it, because the Lamanites were able to kill all the Nephites. All but one guy, this guy named Mormon, who managed to survive by hiding in the woods. And he made sure this whole story was written down in reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics chiseled onto gold plates, which he then buried near Palmyra, New York. Well, I was just on the edge of my seat. I said, "What happened to the Lamanites?" And they said, "Well, they became our Native Americans here in the U.S." And I said, "So you believe the Native Americans are descended from a people who were totally evil?" And they said, "Yes." Then they told me how this guy named Joseph Smith found those buried gold plates right in his backyard. And he also found this magic stone back there that he put into his hat and then buried his face into. And this allowed him to translate the gold plates from the Reformed Egyptian into English. Well, at this point, I just wanted to give these two boys some advice about their pitch. I wanted to say, okay, don't start with this story. I mean, even the Scientologists know to start with a personality test before they start telling people all about Xenu, the evil intergalactic overlord.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
This little Investing Skeptically segment is about how to give, donate, set aside money for kids. Maybe your kids, your grandkids, nieces, nephews, great nieces and nephews, whatever. There's a few choices that are available, and each one of them has pluses and minuses. So I'm going to kind of, off the top of my head, go over a couple of things. One, of course, you could use, and regular listeners know I'm not a big fan, but you could use a 529 to put money into to help them for college. You lose some control issues. There's some problems if you need to take the money out for yourself later, possible tax penalties, and the money in the 529 could, in a small way, reduce aid from a university. Different schools count this money differently. And the biggest problem probably is that there's going to be extra fees. You're probably going to underperform. And if that child doesn't go to college or university, you may have to take the money out, pay the tax and the penalty on all of it, and penalty on the growth. So, it's a limited option, but it might work depending on your specific situation, especially if it's not your kid. Another thing you could do is create a bank account that you share with them if your bank is willing to do that. And different banks have different rules, and some might say they have to be at least 16. Some might say they have to be 18. It depends, and you have to check with your local bank about creating a savings account. Kind of like the college thing, though, the college savings account, a savings account with the child's name will be counted probably by any university they go to as money they actually have. And again, if it's just a couple $100, it doesn't matter. But if it gets to be $20,000 or $30,000, the university might assume that 80, 90, or 100% of the money is available to the student to pay college bills, and it could, again, hurt your options for aid, assistance, benefits, work programs, whatever at college. The other thing, of course, is once they've reached maturity, which I think varies by state and may even have different rules per financial institution, that student could show up as an 18-year-old, let's say, at the bank and say, my name is on there. There's $10,000 in there. Give it to me. And the bank would have no option other than to give it to them because it is, according to the registration title of the account, their money. Another thing you can do is the Uniform Transfers to Minor, UTMA, and I think there's also UGMA, Universal Gift to Minors account. And these have some protections. Again, a university might count it as credit. But if you put the money in there, you cannot change your mind and take it out and become your money again. It's a gift. You gave it away. There's some perks and some taxes you might avoid with this money by giving it away because you're giving it away. And you could still be the trustee of the account and manage it and decide what is in the best interest of the beneficiary, but you can't have it back. So that control thing might be a problem. And again, that might be counted by a university, and it would probably be available to the student, again, depending on the state, 16, 18 years of age, for them to take out and do whatever they want to. Another option is to create a trust. And with the trust, you can have all kinds of guidelines, rules, qualifications for what happens to the money. That requires consultation and probably a generous fee to an attorney, $2,000 to $3,000. If you're in an expensive place like San Francisco or New York or something, it's going to be more than that. But there's also probably ongoing operational costs and tax complications. Money in trusts, money that is made in a trust, earnings or dividends in a trust, if you don't pull them out on an annual basis, it could be very expensive. So again, that probably has more control, and depending on how the trust is set up, it may not be counted by a university, but the fees and expenses could be high enough that if you're only giving a couple of $1,000s, the cost problems are significant to the point that you now haven't given any money, or you may have to pay ongoing fees. Now, if you're going to give 20, 50, 100,000, okay, totally reasonable thing to do is to use a trust. It's these small amounts that are problematic. And quite honestly, I think what the best thing you can do if you want to maintain control of the money and be able to give out whatever you want whenever you want is to just put it in your account. Now, you can use any one of the accounts that you already have, assuming you follow the rules of any of those accounts, and just know in your mind how much you've put in and track it, and that's how much is set aside. If you want it to be much more clearly divisible, at least to you, you could create a new account, even though you already have other accounts. So you may already have an individual / brokerage / taxable account, and you could create a second brokerage account. And in your mind, you know that the $500 that you put in there, that you invested in the total stock market index, all of that you intend to give to the child at the time and for the things that you choose whenever you choose to do so, because it's still your account. Keep in mind, particularly for a child under 12, 14, 15 years of age, there is no way for you to put money into an IRA or a 401k for them in their name. Again, rules vary depending on the specific type of an account, but things like IRAs and 401ks often require earned income, and generally speaking, a 10-year-old can't go out and earn money. And even with this, maybe there's possible workarounds and variations, but it's kind of complicated. And if you put money into one of your kids' IRAs, like for example, if your kid is 30 and they're working a job and they're making okay money, but they're not making enough to save $5,000 or $6,000 a year in their IRA, you could fund their IRA as long as they have sufficient earned income and meet all of the other rules for an IRA or a Roth IRA. But for me, if I was doing it, especially if it's a small amount of money, I'd just open a separate account. Open a new account. It's more hassle. It's one more thing to track. It's one more thing. But you probably were going to open up a new account if you used the Uniform Transfer to Minors anyway. So you were going to have to create an account there. If you went to the bank and set something up, you were creating a new account there. So all of these things require you setting up a new account. So why not just make that new account in your name? You can put in what you want. You can take out what you want. If something really shitty happens in your life, it's your money. You can take it out to pay bills. If things go great and you can keep adding to it, when the time comes, you can just offer to pay for part of college or let them go ahead and get all the loans and then help them pay off college debt afterwards. So just some thoughts, and hopefully that helps somebody. If you have more questions about this, you can email me. Of course, if you have a tax professional and if you're in a position in your life where you want to give away material money for the benefit of some of the next generation, you probably should have a tax professional already. If it's a large amount of money, 20,000, 50,000 bigger, trust may be the way to go, so that it's really clear that this money is for the child. One other thought I skipped over: if you open up a brokerage account for the purposes of tracking what money you have set aside for your grandson, let's just say for an example, you could also name them as the beneficiary of that account. So if something tragic happens to you, the financial system would know that that money is set aside for that child. Again, that gets complicated if they're not an adult. So some things to think about on how to save money or invest for kids. The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Your investment should be based on your situation, and you should consult with your financial advisor before taking any action. The show may contain ads. These ads are placed into the show by the hosting company after I finish recording and editing. I have little control over the content of the ads, and you should not assume that I support their products or claims. If you choose to support the show via the new Patreon page, that support does not create an advisor-client relationship.
The history of discovery, particularly cosmic discovery, but discovery in general, scientific discovery, is one where at any given moment there's a frontier. And there tends to be an urge for people, especially religious people, to assert that across that boundary into the unknown lies the handiwork of God. This shows up a lot. Newton even said it. He had his laws of gravity and motion, and he was explaining the moon and the planet. He was there. He doesn't mention God for any of that. And then he gets to the limits of what his equations can calculate. So can't quite figure this out. Maybe God steps in and makes it right every now and then. That's where he invoked God. And Ptolemy, he bet on the wrong horse, but he was a brilliant guy. He formulated the geocentric universe with Earth in the middle. This is where we got epicycles and the machinations of the heavens. There was still a mystery to him. He looked up and uttered the following words: when I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies. These are the planets going through retrograde and back. The mysteries of the earth. When I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies, I no longer touch earth with my feet. I stand in the presence of Zeus himself and take my fill of ambrosia. What he did was he didn't invoke Zeus to account for the rock that he's standing on or the air he's breathing. It was this point of mystery, and in gets invoked God. This, over time, has been described by philosophers as the God of the gaps. If that's where you're going to put your God in this world, then God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance. If that's how you're going to invoke God, if God is the mystery of the universe, these mysteries, we're tackling these mysteries one by one. If you're going to stay religious at the end of the conversation, God has to be more to you than just where science has yet to tread. So to the person who says, maybe dark matter is God, if the only reason why you're saying it's because it's a mystery, then get ready to have that undone.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
What we're going to do now is kind of a 2020 financial year in review. What did well, what didn't do well, and kind of give you some summary numbers and ideas, and then maybe get into some of the detail and thoughts on how or what to do with this information, how to react to it, what to do with it. And it may depend wildly on what your personal situation is, how much you have, when is retirement, yada, yada, yada. Let me start off with some stuff that everybody wants to know. The S&P 500 in the United States, the Standard & Poor's Corporation has created a list, and they occasionally tweak it. And it has what they think are the 500 most influential companies in the United States of America. And it's a pretty good barometer of what's going on in the stock market. It's way better than the Dow, because the Dow is 30 companies, and it's better than the NASDAQ, which focuses or tries to focus on technology and high tech, and it did really well. I didn't even pull that number up, but it's not one of the ways I slice up the market, so it doesn't really matter to me too much. But I think the NASDAQ was about 40 plus percent. The S&P 500 for the 12 months ending 12/31/2020. I guess I'll just throw it out. Everything I'm going to give is going to be about 12/31 of 2020, unless I say something different, like 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. But they're all as of that ending date. And I've pulled this data from Vanguard's website. So if you look up the S&P 500 fund, which is VFIAX at Vanguard, it will show you that the 1 year return, the last 12 months, again ending 12/31, was 18.37%. You may find other places where it says the return is 18.4, but keep in mind there are some very small expenses at Vanguard which could pull down the performance numbers a 1 or 2 or 3 hundredths of a percent. So it's a very small difference, and the nice thing is, all of these numbers I give you, you can go and pull them up at Vanguard and see them quite easily. If you go to Morningstar, one of the problems with Morningstar is that it will update the information daily. So if you look at it 6 days after you hear this podcast, which could be 7, 10, 15 days after the first of the year, you might get a pretty different number. Sometimes the market can go up or down significantly in a short period of time. So just be advised of that. The nice thing about the Vanguard website is they only update that information quarterly, at least when you look at that specific fund. So the Vanguard S&P 500 Admiral shares, VFIAX, up 18.37% for last year. The normal for the stock market is 10% per year. Almost never does it make 10%. And of course, some years it's way above or way below. You can also check this on Wikipedia, S&P 500 entry in the website Wikipedia. It does say that for 2020, the total return is 18.4%. Also, the return without dividends. Sometimes they'll call it the change in index. Annuity funds might call it point to point or appreciation. It does not include the dividends. That is 16.26. So the dividends were 2.14% this year for the S&P 500. Just for further reference, including dividends, the S&P 500 in 2019 went up 31.49. In 2018, it was down 4.38. 2017 up 21.83. 2016 up about 12. 2015 1.4. And you can go back. The last time we had a big loss for a calendar year is 2008. Sometimes the market can fall 15, 20, 30% in a very quick period of time and recover. And sometimes it doesn't. So that's one of the risks of that. But for reference, if you look at the domestic part of your stock portfolio, your portfolios of the funds that are domestic U.S. stocks, the S&P 500 is a good target to measure against. Now, the interesting thing is that the S&P 500 is broken up or can be broken up into large cap growth and large cap value. And Vanguard does that. There is some overlap. Previously, I've said there's virtually none. I was wrong. There is some overlap. I don't think it's material, but it's there. The thing that I like is those funds, the overlap is much, much smaller than almost any other funds you could buy. You may find this year that you, at least for the U.S. stock part, did way better than 18%. And it might be because you are overweighted in growth stocks. All the small cap, mid cap, and large cap growth did quite well. The Vanguard Large Cap Fund was up 40.19%, 40.2%. The value for the calendar year was up 2.3%. And to me, that is fascinating. Sometimes we can go years and years and years where large cap growth and large cap value, plus and minus in a given year, are off by 1% or 2%. But the last couple years, the growth fund has just been crushing the large cap value fund. What does one do with that information? Now, for me, if I'm in retirement, I really like the idea of scooping cream off the top. So whatever funds have done the best, take a little bit of money out there. I mean, if you had $10,000 in the large cap growth fund and now you have $14,000 and you're in retirement, that'd be a great place to take a couple of $1,000. Really easy. It also, if it's a fund that you've owned for a while, you could sell the shares that you've owned for a while, not anything you've bought in the last year, and only pay capital gains tax rates, whatever that rate might be for you. So if you have just the S&P 500, you made 18.4. But if you have that money in large cap growth and large cap value, one fund made 40%, the other one made slightly over 2%. So you could rebalance. So again, if you had 10,000 in each one at the beginning of the year, now you might have 14,000 in growth and 10,200 in value. And if you're not adding money, and if you're not pulling money out for retirement, you could just sell a couple grand of large cap growth and put it in large cap value. One of the weird things about this rebalancing strategy is it dramatically reduces your volatility year to year to year. That's true. And I think in the long run, you'll get greater performance, anywhere from 0.5% to 1%, maybe 2%, depending on how big the swings are and how much you adjust it. But in the short run, it can look like a really stupid thing to do. And this is something I've touched on before, but I wanted to bring it up again, is that if you have taken money off large cap growth and put it in other areas for the last couple of years, you will have underperformed what you would have made if you just let it ride. You're in large cap growth. That's the best place to be. So you leave it there. And then the second year, it's the best place to be, and you leave it there. And the third place to be, and you leave it there. And that can work, and that will keep working until it doesn't. And the problem is that you don't know in advance when things change, because there have been long periods of time in the U.S. stock market history where large cap value makes 1 to 2 to 3% more per year for a decade or more. It has not been the last decade. The last decade is the decade of large cap growth funds. They've just been the winners, and you can get over concentrated. And if or when that sentiment switches and value becomes the place to put your money, you could have a situation where value maybe only makes 10%, but large cap growth goes down 20%. And now the rebalancing seemed like it was a clever idea, but now it's too late. And so I like to do that on an annualized, just an annual basis. For some really big accounts, million plus, I might do it in a specific quarter, but I kind of keep an eye on the yearly thing. And if you have $10 or $15 or $20,000 and you can't afford to break up, or you don't have enough money to buy all these different funds, well then, you just can't play this little game. But that's something that I would do. If I'm adding money, the large cap value that made just over 2% would be one of the first places I might add money. And the opposite, of course, I'm taking money out. Large cap growth is where I might want to take money out. And so this is something that creates a systemic approach to sell high and buy low. We all know that's a good idea, but when is high and when is low? When you're looking at individual stocks, just because one stock went up and another stock doesn't go up, that doesn't tell you anything about what's going to happen next year at all. But with large index funds that are large segments of the stock market, it kind of does. You don't know when it's going to happen, but historically, it has always happened. When you go back 10, 15, 20 years, all of the segments that I use of the U.S. stock market make about the same. We are now at a point where that divergence is more than normal. And that, again, encourages me to underweight large cap growth going forward and maybe put a little more weight in large cap value, at least when discussing those two funds, because things change. It's not always the top company is not always going to be the top company. I mean, Kodak used to be huge, and now they're barely surviving. Sears was the number one retailer for generations, and now they're not. Things change, things move. Other things, as far as mid cap and small cap, let's see here. Mid cap in total was 18.24, so almost the exact same number as large cap as measured by the S&P 500. Small cap in total was 19. So the interesting thing here is by 1 percentage point, small cap did better than large cap. Again, as measured by the Vanguard index funds with those names. So if you had been piling money into growth, or not to growth, but to large caps, you would have made more money. It's a slight difference, 1% in small cap. But there is the possibility that small cap, because small cap has underperformed for the last few years, that at some point it would catch up. As an example, again, to show you the difference here in small cap funds, the small cap growth made 35 and the small cap value made 6. So again, if you're taking money out, the one that made 35 is a place you might want to start. And if you're adding money, the place that made only 5 would be a place to add. Again, if your account is a little out of whack, you can rebalance. The frequency that one rebalances a year is probably just fine. And it kind of depends on the type of an account that you have. If you have all taxable investments, just be careful because the adjustments you make may create long-term gains. If the bulk of your money is in IRAs, Roth IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, you can do that without worrying about it. So that's some stuff about the U.S. stock market. 18.4 is your thought process of where you should be. So when you get your statement here in the first or second week of January, take a look. If you're all in U.S. stocks, that's a number to look at. If you made 20, 25, 30, 40%, which would be great, yay you, but it may also mean that you have virtually all growth positions and no value positions, which for 2020, that would have been the place to be, and you did great. But what will it be next year? What will it be in the future? I don't know. But again, history shows us that things change. Another investment class, REITs, real estate, down 4.65. So that normally is, in my recommendation, 5 to 10% of all stocks, give or take. So that's a bummer this year, minus 4.65%. I don't know if it's going to change next year. Real estate could still have long-term negative effects from COVID. So I wouldn't get too nutty there. But, you know, we have had years in the past where the stock market and most segments of the stock market make around 10 and real estate makes 25. That's why we have these different asset classes, so that if you're in retirement, you can go in there and you can see all the different types of investments you own. And we call this clarity. And then, of course, the granularity means you can sell or buy individual items. International, which has been returning a terrible either negative amount or 1 or 4 or 5% for a good part of a decade now, actually brightened up quite a bit. The total international fund at Vanguard is up 11.28. The developed fund is up 10.26. International small cap about 12%, and emerging markets up slightly 15%. So depending on the balance of your allocations, internationally, 10, 11, 12, 13% is what you're looking for, depending on the specifics of it. So if you have 75% of your money making 18% and 25% of your money making, 12%, at least as far as a stock balance, then maybe a 15 to 16% return. And I'm not giving you exact numbers because it doesn't fucking matter. What you want to do is look at your portfolio and say, if it's divided 75% in U.S. stocks and 25% in international, a reasonable expectation might be that you made 15 or 16%. If you made 14, okay, whatever. If you made 12, why are you short 3 or 4% compared to just what index funds are? If you have an all stock portfolio and you made 5, well, how the fuck did that happen? If it's all U.S., that's horrific. If it's all international, it's still bad. Did you happen to have all value investments? Maybe you did. Maybe that's why. But maybe you just have some shitty fucking funds. So something to think about. In bonds, interest rates on bonds are horribly low. The Vanguard Short-Term Government Bond Fund, symbol VBIRX, one of the funds that I use, has a current yield of 0.3%. That's right. 1/3, 30% of 1%. But the interesting thing, and this is a fun thing that kind of tricks up people on bonds. If you buy a specific bond, let's say the bond is $10,000 and it pays a 1% yield. So 10,000, 1,000, you're going to get $100 every year. At the end of that time of that bond, you're going to get your, what did I just say, $1,000? Well, let's just say it's $1,000. You put in $1,000, you get your $1,000 back. Oh yeah, it was $10,000. You put in your $10,000, you get your $10,000 back, plus the 1% or $100 of interest you made every year. That's how a bond works. That's the overly simplified version. So the most you ever get out of a bond generally speaking, is your money back plus the yield. If you have a portfolio of bonds, a managed bond fund or an index bond fund, that same philosophy applies, except for they are regularly buying and selling, and bonds end, and so they're liquidated, so it gets more complicated. But basically, what you should expect to make going forward, if you own that bond fund for a number of years, you're going to make approximately what the yield is at the time that you buy it. So if you buy the Vanguard short-term government bond fund and its current yield is 0.3%, and that fund happens to have a duration of 2.8, duration is a mathematical shortcut to help you understand how sensitive to interest rate fluctuations that fund is. But let's just say the duration is 3, and it won't even matter because we're going to say interest rates don't change at all. That would mean that this fund over the next 3 years, and I picked 3 years because that's the duration, the amount of money you're going to make is about 0.3% per year for 3 years. That ain't a lot. Now, the interesting thing is that for the last 12 months, that fund made 4.69, 4.7%. And the yield on it a year ago was close to 1% or maybe even a skosh over. And so part of why that fund made almost 5%, when one would have expected or should expect around 1%, is that as yields go down, the bonds that are being held in the fund become more valuable because people will pay 1% or 2% more to get a fund or a bond that pays 1 or 1.5% versus one that pays 0.3%. So when interest rates fall, the value of the bonds go up. And that made bonds look absolutely phantasmagorical this year. Who would have known? Who could have known more than a year in advance that Trump and COVID together would create such a perilous situation for our economy that the Federal Reserve, instead of increasing rates, would decide to decrease rates? But that's what happened. And so even really educated guessing about the market can be erroneous when something changes that you could not account for, i.e. a global pandemic. So the really conservative bonds that I use made 4 or 5+% this year. Absolutely fantastic. Other things that I might use, Ginnie Mae made 4, the total international bond fund 4.5%, emerging market bonds over 5%, high yield junk bonds 5.4%. So all of these made 4 to 5%. It's not bad. It's not bad for the bond part of your portfolio. I mean, making 4 to 5% when the market is up 18 can be kind of sad, right? Because you think, wow, that money I made 4 or 5%, I could have made 18. Well, you didn't know that a year ago. And you definitely don't want to change now because that's part of the long-term strategy of all of this. Now, some bond funds just crushed it this year. And some of these are funds that Phil does not use. And this makes me sad. At least I don't use them currently. And I'll pick the most egregious example to show off something that I fucked up, at least looking backwards in time. I'm looking at the Vanguard Long-Term Government Bond Fund. This is very, very, very sensitive to changes in interest rates. Its current yield is 1.47 for long-term bonds. I mean, we're talking about bonds with maturities of 15 to 20 years or more. And maybe there's some that are less because they've been in there for a while. That fund made almost 18%. 18% in bonds. And you might think to yourself, well, shit, 18% is way better than 5%. And you would be right. It is way better than 5%. And again, what I did not expect to happen was the pandemic and coronavirus, obviously the same thing, and Trump causing a situation where the Federal Reserve and interest rates went down, pushing up the value. So this specific fund, VLGSX, Vanguard Long-Term Bond Fund, Government Bond Fund. Government bonds in the United States, at least, are generally much more sensitive to interest rate fluctuations than corporate bonds, because corporate bonds incorporate other risks in a more significant, meaningful way. So this fund went up 18%, and I'm not using it. And that's heartbreaking to me, because I could have had a portion of someone's cushion in the long-term bonds and got that 18%. But for almost everybody that's a client, everybody that listens to the show and follows my suggestions, you missed this one. And that's kind of a bummer. The reason you missed it is because there was a generally accepted concept that I agreed with, that interest rates are going to go up because they really can't go down much anymore, but they did. Why they did is a whole nother beautiful topic to discuss, but interest rates did go down. And so if interest rates fall 1% and you're in a fund that has a duration of 19, like this fund, you can expect to make about 18 or 19% because of the change in long-term interest rates, because these bonds that are the bonds that are owned by this index fund become more and more valuable because new bonds pay lower interest rates, and you can buy these older bonds that pay not 1.5%, but 2 or 3 or 4%. And so they're much more valuable to someone to buy, so they might pay a higher price for it. The problem that these types of funds have, and the reason I was not using them, and the reason I am still not using them, even though you can look at the historical data and say these things are amazing, is we are close to, hopefully, I expect. I don't think the United States is going to do like some other countries have done, where they go to negative interest rates. But if interest rates go up, a fund that can make 18% in bonds can turn around on a dime. Maybe I need a different example. It's not money. Can turn around and lose 18% in 12 months. If we get past the pandemic and people have money because of the government stimulus, and they actually sign a bill to improve all the roads and build solar panels and wind turbines across the country and invest in our future, and everyone has money to spend, well, then you face a possibility of a thing called inflation. And if there's the specter of inflation, the Fed will start to raise interest rates. And a fund like this, if interest rates go up 1%, it could lose 18% very, very quickly. I'm talking days. If interest rates go up 2% over the next 2 to 3 to 5 years, you could suddenly be in a position where you're losing 30, 35, 40% in a bond fund. And that's okay if that's what you intended. If you were just trying to get an extra 1% of interest, you probably weren't thinking about the fact that you could lose 40% of your money. So I am not using them in the cushion. If we get to a point in the future, 3, 5, 10 years from now, where interest rates on long-term bonds are more in line with long-term norms, maybe 4, 6, 8%, I would be not only more interested in buying a fund like this, but much more interested. Because if you are getting close towards record high interest rates or historically high interest rates, 8 or 10% for a long-term bond, that is fucking amazing, because not only can you make 8 or 10% without the full stock market risk, you have the possibility that if interest rates then at some point in the future fall, you would make even more than the expected yield. So you have the yield component, you have the default component, which applies a lot more towards things like emerging market or high yield, aka junk bonds. The average junk bond might have a yield of 6 or 7 or 8%, but only end up paying 4 because some of the bonds just couldn't come up with the money. So a reasonably well-balanced, relative conservative bond portfolio, because that's why I use them for the cushion. I want the security. You could have made 4 to 5% last year. So that's nice. If you have bonds or bond funds that made next to nothing or 1% or 2%, I don't know what they're doing. And again, these are all 12/31/2020 numbers. So you'd have to look at that. If you have bond funds that made 8, 10, 15, 20%, congratulations. But how did they do that? Did they do that by taking an incredible amount of risk March of 2020, when the stock market fell 30-something% in a few weeks, so did shitty bond funds. And again, if that's part of your risk profile, that's fine. But if that part of your portfolio you thought was conservative and safe and would protect you when the stock market went down, you got a big surprise, and then you got a big gift because they all bounced back. And you still have that gift today where you can look at your bonds and find out if they're conservative, if they're aggressive, if they're risky, if they're junk bonds, are they short-term, long-term? Take a look at that, and you can take every fund that you own and put it in Morningstar.com and learn a painfully large amount of information about the funds that you have. If that's something you don't want to do on your own, or you want someone else to take a look at it, you can send me an email, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. After we talk, you may choose to send me a document. Do not send any documents or personal information. I mean, your name, phone number, but not your address, not your driver's license number, not your social security number, not a statement, for fuck's sake. But just send me an email. And after we talk, if you still think that that's going to have value to you, I might spend a little time reviewing the funds that you have, or picking one or two examples and walking you through the process that I use with all the data at Morningstar to think about that. So if you're close to retirement and you have, let's say, I'll make it overly simplified, half stocks and half bonds. The part that was half stocks made, let's just call it 18%. The part that was in half bonds maybe made 5%. And so the reason I picked 50-50, because it's easy to do in my head, I'm going to take 18 and add 5 to it. It's 23, cut it in half, 12.5%. You made 12.5% on a very conservative portfolio of half bonds and half stocks. Most years won't be that good for that kind of a portfolio. If you had 20 or 30% in bonds, you might make 15 or 16% on your total portfolio, even with a good chunk of bonds. And again, you want to have as small amount of bonds as possible, but as large as necessary. So the closer you get to retirement, the bigger that amount should probably be. And again, if that's something you want me to take a look at your balance, let me know. Because one of the other reasons I like the Vanguard index funds is a stock fund. And actually, let me do this. I'm at Morningstar. Let's see. Morningstar. Let me put in, oh, you know what? I already have pulled up just by accident, the Vanguard Mid Cap Index. Now, this is growth and value together, which I normally don't use this fund, but it's right here. So we're going to look at it. And the nice thing here is that it's done quite well, of course. But there's an important thing I want to look at this portfolio. And I hadn't planned this in advance, so we're going to roll the dice here a little bit. I'm looking at the portfolio tab at Morningstar, and the fund is 97.88% U.S. stock and about 2% non-U.S. stock. Now, how that 2% got in there, I don't know. Maybe they bought an international company. Maybe a company got bought or sold to an international company, like when Chrysler was bought by Fiat. Those things happen. But if you're buying a domestic fund, like the U.S. stock market mid-cap index fund here that I'm looking at, you really want it to be mostly investing in U.S. stocks. You don't want to buy a U.S. stock fund and find out that half the money is international, because now you don't know what you have. The other thing to look at is cash. And index funds are really good at this. And this fund, its cash holdings at this time is 0.03%. So virtually no cash. Sometimes you can find a mutual fund, especially a managed mutual fund, that might have 1 or 5 or sometimes 20% cash. Well, you already have a cash position in your account, assuming you have one, to rebalance with, or for Phil to get paid if you're a client. So you don't want cash being held in your account and then cash being held in your investments. It creates a drag on your investment, which is why it's so nice that this fund has a 0.03% in cash. So that's some thoughts and some data about what did happen in 2020. Now, one of the things that I have changed gradually over the last few years is a shift away from large cap and a shift away from growth into value. And by having more value in 2020 and a little bit less growth in 2020, your portfolio may not have made as much money it could have if it was in a neutral position. And that's okay. My goal is not to make the most money every year, because that's when you get into the timing stuff. I am a slightly contrarian, so things that do really well, we adjust out of and put it in things that haven't done as well. So when things change, as an example, some of the value stocks are airlines. They're definitely not a growth company. If we get past the pandemic and the people that kept their jobs, that had nowhere to go eat, they couldn't go on any trips or vacations, all decide now that they want to spend their money in travel, airline stocks could go crazy. Well, there's a plausible argument that a value stock would now be worth a whole lot more because that company can do more of what it used to do. And maybe people don't shop online anymore because they're just dying to go back to a mall, which, okay, maybe that's not the best example, but you get the idea. Things change and you don't know in advance what the change is going to be. So you want to kind of be a little bit of everywhere. And again, if you're close to or in retirement, you scoop cream off of the things that have done the best. And if you're adding money, you try to rebalance in, or actually rebalance your portfolio, taking off some of the winners, reducing them, and adding to, I don't want to call them the losers, but the not as goods. So that's part of the systemic approach of selling high and buying low. I'm still pondering, but I'm probably going to shift just a couple percent out of large cap growth again. Just again, lowering the thing that has done the best. And I'm working on a new way of looking at international, maybe adding a couple of Vanguard funds there. And I'll go over that in the near future, but I didn't want to have too much. It's probably already longer than I wanted to make it. But that's some information on the 2020 financial year in review, how much you could have made in stocks and bonds and different types of bonds, places to look for risk exposure that maybe you weren't thinking about. But on the whole, from an investment perspective, actually a pretty good year. This does not mean that it's a good year for all the people that lost jobs or got pay cut or hours cut. That is horrific, of course, and we need to work on that. And hopefully in late January of 2021, we can start making some improvements so that more of the population gets to enjoy some of the economic growth that the country has enjoyed. Because right now it seems to be going a lot to the really, really, really rich people. And that's a problem. That's a problem. Anyway, not the point of this segment. That was 2020 year in review. We've now arrived at the final section of today's podcast. And of course, I am delighted that you could join us and be here for part of the fun. Of course, if you have questions about your portfolio, you can send me an email, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. And I say it all the time, and I'll just repeat it here quickly. Don't send your social security number or your address or a copy of a recent statement. Talk to me first. Send your phone number in your email. I can find some time and call you. We can have a brief conversation. If that's all you need, cool. No cost to you, no nothing. This is what I do. I like to help. If you want to talk more, we can schedule an actual appointment time. Still no cost for anything. If you want me to look at your portfolio, then would be the time to send me the statement, and I can, again, for free, give you some thoughts and comments on it. And I know this is weird for the industry, but I do that because I know that, well, I do it because I like it. I do it because I want to help, but I also do know that a small percentage of people that get free help end up hiring me because they don't want to fuck around with it. And that's cool. It could be a perfect match if you want to pay somebody to help you with your investments, and I want to be paid by you to help you with your investments. It creates a win-win where hopefully you can push off a good chunk of the work and effort and mental stress of trying to figure out what to do, And of course, the positive for me is I get paid, and I like doing this. I was just explaining to somebody the difference between a Roth and a traditional IRA. And they said, oh, you must get tired of doing this. And I said, you know what? I've done this hundreds, if not 1,000 times. It never gets old for me. I really like doing it, which is part of the magic. This podcast and my work, for the most part, there's always exceptions. I really like doing it. And so few people get the opportunity to do something every day that they really enjoy. So thank you for being part of that. One last thought I wanted to throw out, because I stumbled across this as I was looking through the data more, or again, as I often do, looking for interesting things to share with you. I went and looked at the two funds that have had the greatest variation from each other in calendar year 2020. And I was looking at different periods of measurement, which I normally am not that interested in. And I'm normally not going to share it with you or do anything with it, because I don't know that it normally has value, because often the difference between the two that I'm going to talk about are the Vanguard large cap growth and the Vanguard small cap value. Normally the differences, even over a period of a year, are 1% or 2%, and there's no need to do anything or to adjust anything. As my regular listeners know, at some point in the midst of 2020, I changed some of my allocation ratios away from large cap and away from growth to more value positions and to more mid and small cap positions. So, that was something that we did that may have resulted in slightly lower performance throughout the year, but maybe it didn't. And maybe because I was looking at the numbers over the calendar year, I couldn't see the effect of what happened within the year. So just as a curious little fact, for the last 3 months, and this is again from Morningstar, so if you look this up on a different day than I'm looking at it, you might get slightly different information, but it's just to make a point. In the last 3 months, the large cap growth index fund from Vanguard, VIGAX, is up 11.44% in 3 months. Absolutely amazing. However, the Vanguard Small Cap Value Index, VSIAX, over 3 months is up 29.33. So basically you have 11 versus 29. So in a 3-month time period, the Small Cap Value Fund has overperformed by 18%, give or take, in 3 months. And these are the kind of things that can happen very quickly, and you'll never notice it until it's over. So you don't know when all of a sudden you're going to make an extra 18 or 20% in one position versus another in 3 freaking months. And of course, it could reverse and go right back to where it was. But this is why you want to have a variety, a balance, a mix, an exposure to multiple types of stocks, domestic, international bonds versus stocks if you're getting closer to retirement. Because you want to be in the position that goes up before it goes up, not afterwards. So just a fun little fact to throw out there. I just thought it was interesting to add to the conversation of how things have done for the entire calendar year. So in the last 3 months, small cap value made 29, large cap growth made 11, a variance of 18% in just 3 months. So I'm going to wrap up the show. Thank you so much for listening. I do appreciate you being here. If you like the show, you can go to patreon.com/Phil, and you can become a patron and donate a couple of dollars there. You can, of course, also go to Apple Podcasts or Stitcher and leave a 5-star review. That would be greatly helpful to me. Thank you for listening, and I do hope somewhere in the next year to see you out there on the road. Until then, ciao.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
Jesus is my friend.
Jesus is a friend of
I
mine.
have a friend in Jesus.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
Jesus is my friend.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
He taught me how to live my life as it should be. He taught me how to turn my cheek when people laugh at me. I've had friends before, and I can tell you that he's one who will never leave you flat.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
Jesus is my friend.
Jesus is a friend of
I
mine.
have a friend in Jesus.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
Jesus is my friend.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
He taught me how to pray and how to save my soul. He taught me how to praise my God and still play rock and roll. The music may sound different, but the message is the same. It's just an instrument to praise his name.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
Jesus is my friend.
Jesus is a friend of
I
mine.
have a friend in Jesus.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
Jesus is a friend of mine. Jesus is a friend of mine. Jesus is a friend of mine.
Once I tried to run and hide. But Jesus came and found me and he touched me down inside. He is like a Mountie, he always gets his man. And he'll zap you any way he can. Zap.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
Jesus is my friend.
Jesus is a friend of
I
mine.
have a friend in Jesus.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
Jesus is my friend.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
He loves me when I'm right. He loves me when I'm wrong. He loves me when I waste my time by writing silly songs. He loves me when I'm quiet and I have nothing to say. He'll love me when I'm perfect if I ever get that way.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
Jesus is my friend.
Jesus is a friend of
I
mine.
have a friend in Jesus.
Jesus is a friend of mine.
Jesus is my friend.
Jesus is a friend of
I
mine.
have a friend in Jesus.